The boarding announcement for Flight 487 to San Francisco echoed through Terminal 3 at O'Hare International Airport as I clutched 2 first-class tickets in my trembling hands. Passengers were already lining up at Gate B12, their excited chatter about wine country adventures and romantic getaways creating a cruel soundtrack to my growing panic. I checked my phone for the 15th time in 10 minutes. Nothing. No text, no call, no explanation for why my husband Tyler wasn't answering his phone when our flight was boarding in 20 minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My carefully planned surprise anniversary trip to Napa Valley was crumbling before my eyes, and the man I'd spent 3 years trying to make happy was nowhere to be found. I stood there in my new emerald green dress, the one I'd bought specifically for this trip, watching other couples board the plane that was supposed to carry us toward a romantic weekend I'd been planning for months. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to be abandoned at an airport on the very day we'd promised to love each other forever 3 years ago. My name is Rachel Bennett, though I'm starting to think that surname might not suit me much longer. 3 years ago, I walked down the aisle in a designer gown that cost more than my car, believing I was marrying my best friend and partner for life. Tyler Bennett was everything I thought I wanted in a husband. Successful corporate finance executive at Goldman Sachs, devastatingly handsome in that classic American way, with his sandy brown hair and confident smile, and ambitious enough to match what I'd thought were my own dreams. What I hadn't realized was that somewhere between saying I do and standing alone in this airport terminal, I'd stopped dreaming altogether. I'd become Rachel Bennett, supportive wife and social accessory, and buried Rachel Martinez, the woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a degree in hospitality management and had once been offered a position developing boutique hotels for Marriott International. The morning had started like any other Tuesday, except it was supposed to be special. I'd woken up early to pack our bags, carefully folding Tyler's favorite shirts and making sure he had everything he'd need for our romantic getaway. The surprise trip to Napa Valley had been my idea, my planning, my investment. I'd used money from my own savings account, the one Tyler didn't even know existed, to book us into the most exclusive resort in Sonoma County. Auberge du Soleil, where every suite came with panoramic views of the valley, and where I'd dreamed of finally having Tyler's undivided attention for 3 whole days. I'd researched every detail. Wine tastings at boutique vineyards that weren't on the typical tourist routes. Dinner reservations at restaurants where you needed connections just to get on the waiting list. A couple's massage at the resort spa that cost more than most people spent on their entire vacation. I'd even arranged for a private hot air balloon ride over the valley at sunrise, something Tyler had mentioned wanting to do exactly once, 2 years ago, in passing conversation that he'd probably forgotten, but I'd stored away like a precious secret. Tyler had left for work that morning with his usual perfunctory kiss on my cheek, the kind of absent gesture that had become our routine over the past year. He'd been distracted, scrolling through emails on his phone while I'd tried to hint about having something special planned for later. When I'd suggested he come home early for once, he'd mumbled something about a crucial meeting with the Patterson Group and how they were on the verge of closing a deal that could make his career. The Patterson Group. It was always the Patterson Group or the Morrison account or some other client that took priority over everything else in our lives. I'd learned to navigate around Tyler's work schedule like it was a natural disaster, unpredictable, and potentially devastating to any plans I might dare to make. But this was our anniversary. Surely even Tyler, with his laser focus on climbing the corporate ladder, would remember the significance of this particular Tuesday. I'd spent the afternoon getting ready with the kind of careful attention to detail that had once excited me about special occasions. Hair appointment at my salon on North Michigan Avenue, where Sophia had given me subtle highlights that caught the light when I moved. Manicure in a soft nude color that would photograph beautifully against wine glasses and vineyard backdrops. I'd even bought new lingerie from La Perla. spending more than I usually allowed myself to spend on anything purely for my own enjoyment. The emerald green dress had been an impulse purchase from a boutique in Lincoln Park, the kind of place I'd avoided since getting married because Tyler always made comments about my spending. But something about the way the silk had felt against my skin and the way the color had brought out the gold flecks in my brown eyes had made me feel like myself again. Like Rachel Martinez, who'd once commanded respect in boardrooms and had never second-guessed her own judgment. Standing in our Lincoln Park condo that evening, I'd felt beautiful and confident in a way I hadn't experienced in months. Tyler was supposed to be home by 6. I'd told him we had dinner reservations at 7, which was true, though I'd neglected to mention that those reservations were at Auberge du Soleil and required a 3-hour flight to reach. The plan was to surprise him at the last minute, to see his face light up with appreciation for my thoughtfulness and attention to detail. 6 o'clock came and went, then 7. By 8, I was calling his office, only to reach his voicemail with its familiar message about being away from his desk and returning calls within 24 hours. His assistant Patricia had left for the day, and the security guard who answered. The main line told me the office was empty except for the cleaning crew. I'd tried his cell phone repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that he was missing the dinner reservations I'd mentioned. As the evening stretched on, I'd found myself pacing our hardwood floors in my dress and heels, checking my reflection in the hallway mirror, and wondering if I'd somehow become invisible. By 9:30, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. I was going to Napa Valley with or without my husband. I'd changed into comfortable travel clothes, grabbed the suitcase I'd packed for both of us, and called a cab to O'Hare. If Tyler wanted to prioritize work over our anniversary, he could explain himself to an empty apartment. The flight had been delayed, which I'd initially seen as a stroke of luck. Surely Tyler would call or text once he realized I wasn't home. Surely he'd notice that his clothes for the next day weren't laid out on the bed as usual, or that I hadn't left dinner waiting for him in the refrigerator. But as the departure time approached and my phone remained stubbornly silent, I'd been forced to confront a truth I'd been avoiding for months. My husband didn't actually notice me anymore. Somewhere in the 3 years of our marriage, I'd become part of the furniture in his life. Useful, reliable, but not particularly interesting or worthy of active attention. He expected me to be there when he needed something, but he'd stopped seeing me as a person with my own needs, wants, and feelings. The boarding announcement for First Call snapped me back to the present moment. Passengers with young children and those requiring assistance were being invited to board. Around me, couples were gathering their carry-on bags and checking their boarding passes one final time. A woman about my age was laughing at something her husband had whispered in her ear, and I felt a sharp pang of envy at their obvious connection and shared excitement. I looked down at the 2 tickets in my hand. First-class seats 2A and 2B, booked with miles I'd accumulated from business trips Tyler had taken over the past 2 years. Miles I'd helped him earn by managing his travel arrangements, making sure he was upgraded whenever possible, ensuring his life ran smoothly so he could focus on work. Now those miles were going to take me on a solo anniversary trip to wine country, a journey I'd never imagined taking without the man I'd married. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart leaped with hope. Finally. Tyler had realized his mistake and was rushing to the airport to join me. But when I looked at the screen, it wasn't Tyler's name I saw. It was my sister Jessica, texting from her apartment in Wicker Park. "Hey Rach, tried calling but you didn't answer. Want to grab drinks tonight? Daniel's in town from San Francisco and wants to catch up with both of us. Daniel Chen." I hadn't thought about him in over a year, though there'd been a time when we'd talked almost every week. He'd been my study partner in graduate school, the brilliant and ambitious classmate who'd gone on to develop boutique hotels in California, while I'd gotten married and forgotten I'd ever had professional ambitions of my own. Daniel had always believed I was capable of more than I gave myself credit for. And he'd never hidden his disappointment when I'd turned down that Marriott position to focus on being Tyler's wife. The final boarding call for Flight 487 echoed through the terminal. Passengers were moving toward the gate with increasing urgency, and I realized I had perhaps 2 minutes to make a decision that would define the rest of my anniversary, if not the rest of my marriage. I could go home, return to our empty condo, wait for Tyler to eventually show up with whatever excuse he'd concocted for missing our dinner reservations, and pretend that being forgotten on our anniversary was acceptable behavior from the man who'd promised to cherish me forever. I could continue being the accommodating wife who adapted to his schedule, who made excuses for his inattention, who'd gradually shrunk her own life to fit around the edges of his ambitions. Or I could get on that plane. I could take the trip I'd planned, see the vineyards I'd researched, stay in the luxurious suite I'd booked, and remember what it felt like to prioritize my own happiness for once. I could spend 3 days in one of the most beautiful places in the world, doing exactly what I wanted to do, when I wanted to do it, without having to consider anyone else's schedule or preferences. The gate agent was making the final call for boarding, her voice carrying a note of urgency that suggested the plane would be leaving with or without any remaining passengers. I looked around the terminal one more time, hoping against hope to see Tyler running toward me with his garment bag and an apologetic smile. But the only people I saw were strangers hurrying to their own destinations, focused on their own lives and relationships. Standing there in Terminal 3, clutching those first-class tickets and feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my adult life, I made a decision that would change everything. I walked up to the gate agent, handed her my boarding pass, and said words I'd never imagined I'd need to say. "Just one passenger today. My husband couldn't make it." The gate agent smiled sympathetically and processed my ticket without comment. She'd probably seen countless travelers dealing with last-minute changes and personal dramas. To her, I was just another passenger boarding a delayed flight to San Francisco. She had no way of knowing that I was a woman stepping away from a marriage that had slowly suffocated her authentic self, or that this solo trip would be the first step toward reclaiming a life I'd forgotten I wanted to live. As I walked down the jetway toward the plane, I pulled out my phone and sent Tyler a text message. Not an angry rant or a detailed explanation of my hurt feelings, but something simple and direct. "Gone to Napa for our anniversary as planned. See you when I get back." I turned off my phone without waiting for a response and settled into seat 2A, the window seat I'd specifically requested so Tyler could have the aisle. The flight attendant offered me champagne, and for the first time in years, I accepted alcohol on a flight without considering how it might affect Tyler's comfort or image. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, I looked out the window at the lights of Chicago disappearing below us. Somewhere in that sprawling city was my husband, probably still in whatever meeting he'd considered more important than our anniversary. In a few hours, he'd come home to an empty apartment and would have to confront the fact that his wife had finally stopped waiting for him to remember she existed. But I wasn't thinking about Tyler anymore. For the first time in 3 years, I was thinking about myself, about what I wanted to see and do and experience, about the woman I'd been before I'd become so focused on being the perfect wife that I'd forgotten to be an interesting person. The plane lifted off into the night sky, carrying me toward Napa Valley and toward a version of myself I'd nearly lost forever. I didn't know what the next 3 days would bring, but I knew they would be entirely mine. No compromises, no accommodations, no consideration for anyone's needs but my own. As Chicago disappeared beneath the clouds, I realized I was smiling, for the first time in months. Tyler had left me stranded at the airport on our anniversary, but instead of breaking my heart, he'd accidentally set me free. And by the time I returned to Chicago, I was going to make sure he understood exactly what he'd lost when he'd chosen a meeting over his marriage. The flight attendant refilled my champagne glass, and I raised it in a silent toast to new beginnings. Phase 1 of my transformation was already complete. I'd stopped waiting for permission to live my own life. Now I was going to remember what that life could look like when I was the one making the decisions. 3 hours and 45 minutes later, I would land in San Francisco with a plan that would change everything. But for now, I was content to sit in my first-class seat, sipping champagne and watching the country pass by below me, finally heading toward something that was entirely my own choice. The woman who'd boarded this plane was still Rachel Bennett, the forgotten wife who'd been abandoned at an airport on her anniversary. But the woman who would step off in California would be someone different. Someone who remembered that she'd once been capable of extraordinary things, and who was ready to prove it to herself and everyone else who'd underestimated her. Tyler had no idea what was coming, but he was about to find out that leaving me stranded had been the biggest mistake of his life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We need more people in this industry who understand that luxury doesn't have to mean superficial. The second stop on my itinerary was a boutique inn called Maison Blanc, where I'd booked a wine and cheese pairing lunch. The property was everything. I'd hoped it would be based on my online research. A converted French manor house surrounded by lavender fields and olive groves. But what I hadn't expected was to find Daniel Chen sitting at a corner table in the restaurant, reviewing architectural plans with obvious intensity. He looked exactly as I remembered, perhaps a little more polished in his expensive casual clothing, but with the same focused energy that had made him such an effective study partner. His black hair was shorter now, styled in a way that suggested success without trying too hard to announce it. When he looked up from his documents and saw me standing in the restaurant entrance, his expression shifted through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been genuine pleasure. "Rachel. Martinez," he said, standing up with a smile that made me remember why I'd once found him so attractive. Or I suppose it's Rachel Bennett now. "Margaret at Auberge du Soleil told me you might be stopping by." "Hello, Daniel," I replied, suddenly conscious of my appearance in a way I hadn't been in years. I'd dressed carefully for my wine country. Exploration. Choosing a flowing sundress in deep blue that complemented my coloring and comfortable sandals that could handle walking through vineyards. "It's good to see you." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Would you like to join me? I was just reviewing plans for our new property, but I'd much rather catch up with an old friend." As I settled into the chair, I noticed how the other diners in the restaurant seemed to regard Daniel with a mixture of respect and curiosity. This was clearly someone who commanded attention in the hospitality world, someone whose opinions and decisions carried weight. "So," Daniel said, closing his laptop and giving me his full attention, "what brings you to Napa Valley? Please tell me you're finally putting that brilliant mind of yours to work in the industry." The directness of his question caught me off guard. When had anyone last asked me about my professional life with the assumption that I might actually have one? "I'm on vacation," I said, then found myself adding, "Alone, actually. My husband couldn't make it." Something flickered in Daniel's expression, but he was too polite to pursue the obvious implications of that statement. Instead, he signaled the server to bring another wine list. "Well then, we'll have to make sure you have an exceptional experience. Tell me what you've seen so far." I described my morning at Domaine Martinez, sharing Elena's insights about sustainable winemaking and authentic hospitality experiences. Daniel listened with the kind of engaged attention that made me remember how much I'd enjoyed our academic discussions, how he'd always pushed me to think more deeply about industry challenges and opportunities. "Elena Martinez is brilliant," Daniel said when I finished describing the tasting experience. "She's exactly the kind of local partner we look for when we're developing properties in wine regions. Someone who understands that luxury travelers want authentic connections, not manufactured experiences." He paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me wonder what he was seeing there. "Rachel, can I ask you something? What are you doing with your life these days?" And I don't mean what charity boards you serve on, or how you spend your husband's money. I mean, what are you doing that engages that remarkable brain of yours? The question hit like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel, but because it was so precisely targeted at the emptiness I'd been trying to ignore for the past 3 years. When had I last done anything that required the analytical skills I'd developed in graduate school? When had I last solved a complex problem or created something meaningful? I manage our household, I said finally, the words sounding hollow, even to my own ears. I handle our social obligations, coordinate our travel, maintain our relationships. Daniel's expression didn't change, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. It was the same look he'd given me when I'd told him I was turning down the Marriott position to focus on my marriage. That's not what I asked, he said gently. Those are things you do for someone else. What do you do for yourself? The question hung in the air between us, impossible to answer honestly without admitting that I'd spent 3 years systematically erasing my own identity. The woman who'd once written detailed business plans for boutique hotel concepts had become someone who considered choosing a restaurant for date night the height of decision-making autonomy. I'm not sure I remember, I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. Daniel leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Rachel, I don't know what's happened in your marriage, and it's none of my business. But I remember the woman who designed a sustainable luxury resort concept that could have revolutionized ecotourism. I remember someone who believed that hospitality could be a force for cultural preservation and community development. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Pacific Luxury Properties is expanding into the Midwest. We're looking for someone to lead our boutique hotel development in Chicago. Someone who understands both luxury hospitality and local market dynamics. The position would involve everything from site selection to concept development to operational planning. My heart started beating faster as he outlined the scope of the role. It was everything I'd dreamed of doing when I was studying hospitality management, the kind of position that would allow me to combine creative vision with analytical rigor. The salary would be substantial, Daniel continued, and the creative autonomy would be complete. We believe in hiring experts and trusting them to do their work without micromanagement. I thought about Tyler, about how he'd react to the idea of his wife taking on a demanding career that might require travel and long hours, about how he'd never once asked whether I missed working, whether I felt intellectually understimulated, whether I had professional ambitions beyond supporting his own career advancement. Why are you offering this to me? The Auberge du Soleil exceeded every expectation I'd harbored during the months of planning this trip. My suite overlooked rolling hills covered in perfectly manicured vineyards, their geometric patterns creating a living tapestry that stretched toward distant mountains shrouded in morning mist. The California sunshine streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows felt different somehow, warmer and more purposeful than the harsh fluorescent lighting of our Chicago condo. I'd slept better than I had in months, perhaps because for the first time in years I hadn't spent the evening waiting for Tyler to finish responding to emails or take one more important call. Instead, I'd ordered room service, taken a long bath in the oversized soaking tub, and fallen asleep reading a novel I'd purchased at the airport without considering whether Tyler would approve of my choice in literature. Waking up alone in paradise should have felt lonely, but instead I felt liberated. There was no one to consult about breakfast plans, no schedule to coordinate, no need to wait for anyone else to decide what they wanted to do with the day. For the first time in 3 years, every decision was entirely mine. My phone had remained off since boarding the plane, a deliberate choice that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Tyler had probably discovered my absence by now, had probably tried calling and texting, had probably experienced his first genuine moment of concern about my whereabouts since we'd gotten married. The thought should have made me feel guilty, but instead it filled me with a strange sense of satisfaction. The concierge at Auberge du Soleil was a sophisticated woman named Margaret, who greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that made solo travelers feel valued rather than pitied. When I explained that my husband had been unable to join me due to a work emergency, she immediately began suggesting modifications to my itinerary that would enhance the solo experience rather than simply accommodate it. "Mrs. Bennett," Margaret said, reviewing the extensive list of reservations I'd made, "you've planned quite an impressive trip. Most couples don't venture beyond the standard Napa tourist trail, but these vineyards you've selected represent some of the most innovative winemaking in the valley. Do you have a background in wine or hospitality?" The question caught me off guard. When had anyone last asked about my background, my interests, my expertise? Tyler's colleagues knew me only as his wife, and our social circle had long ago stopped inquiring about my thoughts on anything more substantial than restaurant recommendations or vacation destinations. "I studied hospitality management at Northwestern," I replied, surprised by how good it felt to mention my education aloud. "I specialized in luxury travel and boutique hotel development, though I haven't worked in the industry since getting married." Margaret's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "How fascinating! You know, we're always looking for consultants who understand both the operational and guest experience aspects of luxury hospitality. The owner of this property also develops boutique hotels throughout California and has been expanding into other markets." Before I could fully process what she was suggesting, Margaret had handed me a business card for someone named Daniel Chen, Director of Development for Pacific Luxury Properties. The name stopped me cold. "Daniel Chen," I repeated slowly. "Does he happen to be originally from Chicago?" "Yes, actually. He graduated from Northwestern's hospitality program about 5 years ago and has been revolutionizing boutique hotel development on the West Coast ever since. Do you know him?" I stared at the business card, memories flooding back of late-night study sessions and passionate discussions about transforming the hospitality industry. Daniel had always believed that luxury hotels should be more than just places to sleep, that they should create transformative experiences that connected guests with local culture and natural beauty. He'd been accepted to the same graduate program at Cornell that I'd turned down to focus on my relationship with Tyler. "We were classmates," I said finally. "Study partners, actually." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Small world. He's actually here this week, overseeing the final details of a new property launch in Healdsburg. I could arrange an introduction if you're interested." The old Rachel would have politely declined, not wanting to complicate her vacation with unexpected social obligations. But the woman sitting in this luxury resort, having flown across the country alone after being abandoned at an airport, was discovering that she might be someone entirely different. "I'd like that very much," I heard myself saying. The first vineyard on my carefully planned itinerary was a small family operation called Domaine Martinez, a coincidence that felt like a sign from the universe. The owner, Elena Martinez, was a woman about my age who'd inherited the vineyard from her grandmother and had spent the past decade transforming it into one of Napa's most respected small producers. "Most people don't discover us without a personal recommendation," Elena said as she led me through rows of Pinot Noir vines that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. "How did you hear about our wines?" I explained my research process, how I'd spent weeks reading wine journals and hospitality, trade publications to identify experiences that went beyond the typical tourist offerings. Elena listened with the kind of attention I'd forgotten people were capable of giving, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity about my thought process and planning approach. "You have an excellent eye for authentic experiences," Elena observed as we settled into her tasting room, a converted barn that managed to feel both rustic and elegant. "Most visitors want the big-name vineyards and the Instagram-worthy moments. You've selected places that prioritize substance over spectacle." As Elena poured samples of her award-winning wines, I found myself sharing details about my background that I hadn't discussed in years. My undergraduate thesis on sustainable tourism. My graduate work on creating authentic luxury experiences. The business plan I'd developed for a boutique hotel concept that would showcase local artisans and farmers. That sounds exactly like what Daniel Chen is developing with Pacific Luxury Properties, Elena said, refilling my glass with a reserve Chardonnay that tasted like sunshine and possibility. You know, he's been looking for someone with your specific combination of academic background and practical understanding of luxury hospitality. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, far longer than the standard tasting experience. Elena introduced me to her winemaker, a young woman who'd trained in Burgundy and brought European techniques to California grapes. We discussed the challenges of building a luxury brand without losing authentic character, the importance of creating experiences that educated rather than simply entertained guests. By the time I left Domaine Martinez, I felt intellectually stimulated in a way I hadn't experienced since graduate school. Elena insisted I take a bottle of her reserve Pinot Noir as a gift, and she'd written her personal phone number on the back of her business card. "Promise me you'll consider coming back," she said as I climbed into the rental car I'd arranged at the airport. I asked. "I haven't worked in the industry in 3 years. My resume has a significant gap." Daniel smiled, and for a moment, I saw the ambitious graduate student I'd once known, the one who'd believed we could change the world through thoughtful hospitality design. Because talent doesn't disappear, Rachel. It just gets buried under other people's expectations. And because I remember how you used to light up when you talked about creating transformative travel experiences, I'd bet anything that passion is still there, waiting for the right opportunity. We spent the next 2 hours discussing the hotel development project, and I found myself drawing on knowledge and insights I'd thought I'd forgotten. Daniel showed me architectural renderings and market analysis reports, asking for my input on everything from location strategy to amenity selection. My suggestions came naturally, informed by both my academic training and my years of high-end travel with Tyler. "You haven't lost a step," Daniel observed as our conversation began to wind down. "If anything, your perspective seems more sophisticated now, more nuanced." As the afternoon sun began to slant through the restaurant windows, Daniel gathered his materials and prepared to leave for another appointment. But before he stood up, he placed a folder on the table between us. "Take this," he said. "It's the complete project overview, including compensation details and timeline. I'm not asking for an answer today, or even this week, but I want you to know that the offer is real, and it's yours if you want it." After Daniel left, I sat alone in the restaurant for another hour, slowly working my way through a glass of local Sauvignon Blanc while studying the documents he'd given me. The position he'd described wasn't just a job, it was a career that would allow me to rebuild my professional identity from the ground up. The compensation package was more than generous. The creative scope was everything I'd once dreamed of pursuing. And the timing felt like the universe offering me a choice between the life I'd been living and the life I'd forgotten I wanted. As evening approached, I returned to Auberge du Soleil and finally turned on my phone. The screen immediately filled with notifications. 23 missed calls from Tyler, 14 text messages, 3 voicemails. I scrolled through the messages, watching Tyler's tone evolve from confusion to irritation to what might have been genuine concern. The first text, sent around midnight Chicago time, simply said, "Where are you?" By morning, his messages had become more demanding. "Rachel, this isn't funny. Call me back immediately." The most recent message, sent just an hour ago, carried a different tone entirely. "I'm worried about you. Please just let me know you're safe." I stared at that last message for a long time, trying to decide how I felt about Tyler's concern. Was he worried about my safety? Or was he worried about the disruption my absence was causing to his routine? When was the last time he'd expressed concern about my emotional well-being rather than my availability to manage his needs? Instead of calling Tyler, I composed a single text message. In Napa Valley as planned. Having a wonderful time. We'll call tomorrow. I turned the phone off, again without waiting for his response. Whatever Tyler was feeling about my absence, it could wait until I'd finished rediscovering who I was when I wasn't trying to be the perfect wife. That evening, I had dinner alone on the terrace of my suite, watching the sun set over the valley, while reviewing Daniel's project proposal. The bottle of reserve Pinot Noir from Domaine Martinez paired perfectly with the restaurant's signature dish, and I found myself making mental notes about how the presentation and service could enhance the overall guest experience. For the first time in 3 years, I was thinking like a hospitality professional rather than a customer. I was analyzing the operational details, considering how different elements contributed to the luxury atmosphere, imagining how similar concepts could be applied to boutique hotel development in Chicago. As the stars appeared overhead and the valley settled into peaceful darkness, I realized I'd spent an entire day without once considering what Tyler would think of my choices. I'd selected wines based on my own preferences, engaged in professional conversations that interested me, and made decisions about how to spend my time without consulting anyone else's schedule or priorities. It was intoxicating. This sense of autonomy, of being valued for my expertise rather than my accommodation, of rediscovering intellectual curiosity I'd thought was permanently buried. Daniel had reminded me that I'd once been capable of sophisticated analysis and creative problem-solving, skills that had nothing to do with my ability to support someone else's ambitions. Tomorrow, I would visit 2 more vineyards and have lunch at a restaurant I'd selected purely because their menu sounded interesting. I would continue exploring a region I'd researched extensively, guided by my own curiosity rather than anyone else's preferences. And I would think seriously about Daniel's offer, about the possibility of rebuilding a professional life that could exist independently of my marriage. Tyler had left me stranded at the airport, thinking he was choosing work over our anniversary celebration. What he'd actually done was give me the push I'd needed to remember that I was capable of creating my own adventures, my own opportunities, my own sense of worth. As I prepared for bed in my luxurious suite, surrounded by the silence of wine, country, and the satisfaction of a day spent entirely on my own terms, I realized that this solo anniversary trip was becoming something much more significant than a romantic getaway. It was becoming a rediscovery of the woman I'd been before I'd made my husband's approval the center of my universe. And that woman, it turned out, was someone Tyler had never actually bothered to know. The question was whether she was someone who still wanted to be married to him. The return flight to Chicago felt different from my departure 3 days earlier. I wasn't the same woman who'd boarded that plane in desperation and hurt feelings. The Rachel Bennett who'd been abandoned at O'Hare was someone I could barely recognize now, someone who'd waited for permission to live her own life and had measured her worth by another person's attention. The woman sitting in seat 2A now carried Daniel's project folder in her laptop bag alongside business cards from 3 vineyard owners, 2 restaurant managers, and a luxury travel consultant who'd specifically sought me out after hearing about my hospitality background. My phone contained contact information for people who valued my professional opinion, who'd asked thoughtful questions about my experience and insights, who'd treated me as an expert rather than an accessory. I'd spent my final morning in Napa Valley having breakfast with Margaret from Auberge du Soleil, who'd connected me with the resort's general manager to discuss their expansion plans into the Chicago market. The conversation had been sophisticated and challenging, touching on everything from local zoning regulations to cultural integration strategies for luxury hospitality brands entering new geographic markets. We've been looking for the right consultant to help us navigate the Midwest market, the general manager had explained over perfectly prepared eggs Benedict and locally sourced coffee. Someone who understands both operational excellence and regional preferences. Your insights about Chicago's neighborhood dynamics and cultural expectations are exactly what we need. By the time I'd left the resort, I had 3 concrete consulting opportunities, and a standing invitation to return for their quarterly strategic planning meetings. More importantly, I had proof that my skills hadn't atrophied during my years of domestic hibernation, that the hospitality expertise I developed in graduate school had actually deepened through my exposure to luxury travel and high-end service standards. The plane descended through cloud cover toward Chicago, and I watched the familiar skyline emerge below us. Somewhere in that sprawling urban landscape was the Lincoln Park condo I shared with Tyler, the apartment where I'd spent 3 years making myself smaller and smaller to accommodate his expanding ego. The thought of returning to that space, to the routine of managing Tyler's life while ignoring my own ambitions, felt suffocating. But I wasn't the same person who'd left Chicago 3 days ago. I had Daniel's folder, Margaret's contact information, and Elena's wine recommendations. I had evidence that the professional world remembered Rachel Martinez, even if Rachel Bennett had forgotten her. More importantly, I had a plan. Tyler was waiting in our living room when I unlocked the front door, looking haggard and genuinely distressed in a way I hadn't seen since his early days as a junior associate. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his hair uncombed and his expensive shirt wrinkled from what had obviously been a sleepless night. Empty coffee cups and takeout containers cluttered the coffee table, suggesting he'd been camping, out in the living room rather than maintaining his normal routines. "Rachel," he said, standing up so quickly he knocked over his laptop. "Thank God you're home. I've been worried sick." I set down my suitcase and studied my husband's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the genuine relief in his expression. This was probably the most emotional I'd seen Tyler since our wedding day, and I found myself curious about what had prompted such an extreme reaction to my brief absence. "Hello, Tyler," I replied calmly, removing my jacket and hanging it in the hall closet with the same methodical care I'd always employed in our home. "How was your important meeting with the Patterson Group?" The question hit its target precisely. Tyler's face flushed with what might have been shame or embarrassment, and he ran his hands through his already disheveled hair. "The Patterson meeting," he repeated slowly. "Rachel, I need to explain about that." "Do you?" I asked, settling into the armchair across from the couch where he'd been keeping his vigil. "I'm not sure an explanation is necessary. You made your priorities quite clear on Tuesday evening." Tyler began pacing behind the couch, a nervous habit that typically preceded his most difficult conversations. I'd seen this behavior during his struggles with challenging cases, but never in the context of our relationship. "The meeting ran late," he began, then stopped himself. "No, that's not entirely accurate. The meeting was scheduled to run late, and I chose not to reschedule it even though I knew we had dinner plans." I appreciated his honesty, even as it confirmed what I'd already understood about his decision-making process. Tyler had known exactly what he was doing when he'd prioritized work over our anniversary, and he'd assumed I would accept his choice, without complaint, as I'd done countless times before. "I see," I replied neutrally. "And what made you realize this might have been a mistake?" Tyler stopped pacing and looked directly at me, and I could see him struggling to formulate an answer. "That wouldn't further incriminate him. When I came home and you weren't here," he said finally, "when I realized you'd actually left for our trip without me, I've never seen you do anything like that before." The admission revealed more about our marriage dynamics than Tyler probably intended. He'd been genuinely shocked by my independent action, not because he was concerned about my well-being, but because I'd never asserted my own needs in such a direct and uncompromising way. "So you were surprised that I followed through on the plans I'd made?" I asked. "Even after you chose not to participate?" "I was surprised that you didn't wait for me to explain," Tyler replied, though his tone suggested he was beginning to recognize how weak that sounded. "I assumed you'd understand that work sometimes requires flexibility." I thought about my 3 days in Napa Valley, about the vineyard conversations and strategic planning meetings and professional opportunities that had materialized simply because I'd been present and engaged rather than waiting at home for Tyler to finish his important business. I did understand that work requires flexibility, I said. I understood it so well that I decided to explore some work opportunities of my own. Tyler's expression shifted from relief to confusion to something approaching concern. Work opportunities? I reached for Daniel's project folder, noting how Tyler's eyes tracked the expensive portfolio and professional-looking documents I extracted from it. I've been offered a position as Director of Boutique Hotel Development for Pacific Luxury Properties, I said, watching Tyler's face carefully as I spoke. It's a senior-level consulting role focused on expanding their Chicago market presence. The silence that followed was profound. Tyler stared at me as if I'd announced my intention to become an astronaut or professional athlete, something so far removed from his understanding of my capabilities that he couldn't process the information. A job? He repeated finally. Rachel, you haven't worked in 3 years. Who would offer you a senior position? The dismissive tone in his voice triggered something cold and determined in my chest. This was exactly how Tyler saw me, as someone whose professional credibility had expired the moment I'd become his wife. Daniel Chen, I replied calmly. He's the Director of Development for Pacific Luxury Properties, and he happened to be in Napa Valley overseeing a new property launch. We worked together extensively in graduate school, and he's familiar with my qualifications. Tyler's face darkened at the mention of another man's name, but I could see him processing the implications of my statement. Pacific Luxury Properties was a name he'd recognized from business journals and luxury travel publications, a company that commanded respect in hospitality circles. Daniel Chen, Tyler repeated, and I could hear the suspicion building in his voice. This is someone you just happened to run into during your solo vacation? This is someone who values my professional expertise, I corrected. Something you might not understand, given that you've never shown any interest in my educational background or industry knowledge. Tyler began pacing again, clearly agitated by this unexpected development. Rachel, we need to discuss this rationally. You can't just accept a job without considering how it would affect our life, our marriage, our plans. I opened Daniel's folder and spread the project documents across our coffee table, noting how Tyler's eyes widened as he took in the scope and sophistication of the materials. What plans? I asked. The plans where I manage your household? And social calendar while you focus on advancing your career? The plans where my professional aspirations remain permanently deferred while yours take priority? Tyler stopped pacing and looked at the documents more carefully, and I could see him beginning to understand that this wasn't a casual job offer, but a serious career opportunity with substantial compensation and responsibility. This is a real position, he said, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. Did you think I was lying? I asked. Or did you think I was so professionally worthless that no legitimate company would consider hiring me? Tyler's face flushed again, and I could see him recognizing how his assumptions about my capabilities had been exposed by his reaction. I didn't mean that, he said quickly. I just meant that it's been a while since you've worked in hospitality, and the industry has probably changed. I thought about my conversations with Elena Martinez and Margaret at Auberge du Soleil, about how naturally I'd engaged with complex operational challenges and strategic planning questions, about how my insights had been not just welcomed, but actively sought out. The industry has changed, I agreed. It's become more sophisticated, more focused on authentic experiences and cultural integration, exactly the kind of challenges I'm trained to handle. I could see Tyler struggling to reconcile this professional version of me with the accommodating wife he'd grown accustomed to living with. The woman sitting across from him now wasn't asking his permission to pursue a career. She was informing him of a decision she'd already made. What about us? Tyler asked finally. What about our marriage? This job would require travel, long hours, complete career focus. When would we have time together? The question revealed the fundamental selfishness that had shaped our entire relationship. Tyler had never considered how his own career demands affected our time together, had never worried about the impact of his long hours and frequent travel on our connection. But the moment my professional life might require similar commitments, he framed it as a threat to our marriage. "When was the last time you adjusted your work schedule to spend time with me?" I asked. "When was the last time you turned down a business trip or left the office early because you wanted to be with your wife?" Tyler opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly unable to identify a specific instance when he'd prioritized our relationship over his professional advancement. That's different," he said finally. "My career is already established. We depend on my income, my position, my professional relationships." "Do we?" I asked, pulling out the compensation details from Daniel's offer. "Because according to this salary structure, my potential income would be quite substantial, possibly more than you're currently earning." Tyler's face went pale as he processed the numbers on the compensation sheet. I could see him calculating not just the financial implications, but the social and professional ramifications of having a wife who out-earned him. "Rachel, this is happening too fast," he said, settling onto the couch across from me. "You've been home for 10 minutes, and you're already talking about completely restructuring our life. Can't we discuss this like rational adults?" I thought about our 3 years of marriage, about how Tyler had never once sought my input on his career decisions, had never asked whether I wanted to relocate for his advancement opportunities, had never considered how his professional choices affected my life. "By rational discussion, do you mean the kind where you explain why your career aspirations are legitimate while mine are impractical?" I asked. "Or the kind where we pretend that your work has always been more important than our relationship, and now suddenly you're concerned about work-life balance?" Tyler's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and I watched him glance at the screen, with obvious irritation. For a moment, I thought he might actually ignore the call to continue our conversation. But then his expression shifted to the familiar look of professional urgency, and he answered the phone with his standard business greeting. "Tyler Bennett speaking." I listened to him discuss meeting schedules and client demands with the same focused attention he'd never given to my own needs or concerns. This was Tyler in his element, managing professional relationships with careful attention to detail and diplomatic courtesy. It was also Tyler demonstrating once again that work interruptions were acceptable when they served his priorities, but problematic when they interfered with his control over my decisions. After Tyler finished his call, he turned back to me with an expression of determined charm, the same look he'd worn during our courtship when he'd wanted to convince me to accommodate his preferences. "I'm sorry about that," he said, though we both knew he wasn't. "Where were we?" "Right, your job offer. Rachel, I want you to know that I'm proud of you for being approached for such a significant position. It speaks well of your reputation in the industry." The condescending tone made my teeth clench, but I kept my expression neutral. Tyler was deploying his negotiation tactics, offering minimal concessions while working toward his preferred outcome. "However," he continued, "I think we need to consider the practical implications very carefully. This would be a major change for both of us, and change requires careful planning." I thought about Daniel's timeline for the Chicago project, about the boutique hotel sites he'd identified in River North and the Loop, about the investors who were waiting for market analysis and concept development. This wasn't a position that could accommodate lengthy deliberation or spousal approval processes. "What kind of planning?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew what Tyler was going to suggest. "Well, we'd need to restructure our household. Management, our social obligations, our financial planning," Tyler said, warming to his theme. "I could help you negotiate better terms, perhaps a consulting arrangement rather than full-time employment, something that would give you professional satisfaction without completely disrupting our established life." There it was. Tyler's solution to my career aspirations was to manage them the same way he managed everything else in our marriage, to reshape them into something that served his comfort and convenience rather than my professional growth. The position isn't negotiable, Tyler, I said firmly. Daniel's offer is for Director of Development, not part-time consultant. It's a senior executive role with substantial responsibility and authority. Tyler's expression shifted to something approaching frustration, and I could see him recognizing that his standard persuasion techniques weren't working as expected. Rachel, be realistic, he said, his tone becoming more direct. You've been out of the workforce for 3 years. Do you really think you're ready to jump into a high-pressure executive position? Wouldn't it make more sense to start with something smaller, something that would let you ease back into professional life? The suggestion revealed how completely Tyler had misunderstood both my capabilities and my ambitions. He genuinely believed that my 3 years of managing his sophisticated social and travel requirements had somehow diminished my professional skills rather than refined them. I think, I said carefully, that I'm the best judge of my own capabilities and career readiness. Tyler leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. What I don't understand is why you're rushing into this decision. Why can't you take time to consider all the options? Why does it have to be this specific job with this specific company? I thought about my morning conversations with industry professionals who'd treated my insights as valuable contributions rather than amusing observations. I thought about Elena Martinez asking thoughtful questions about my strategic analysis of wine tourism trends. I thought about Margaret at Auberge du Soleil specifically seeking my input on market expansion challenges. Because this is the first time in 3 years that anyone has valued my professional expertise, I said. Because this is the first opportunity I've had to use my education and skills for something meaningful. Because I'm tired of defining myself entirely through my relationship to you. The last statement hung in the air between us like a declaration of war. Tyler stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a combination of shock, hurt, and something approaching fear. That's not fair, Rachel, he said quietly. I've never asked you to define yourself through our relationship. I've always supported your interests and activities. I thought about the gallery openings Tyler had attended while checking his phone, the charity events where he'd networked while I'd made polite conversation with other wives, the dinner parties where my role had been to ensure his comfort and social success rather than to express my own opinions or interests. You've supported the version of me that enhances your life, I replied. You've never shown any interest in the version of me that might have independent ambitions. Tyler's phone buzzed again, and this time he ignored it completely, focusing his full attention on my face with an intensity that felt both unfamiliar and long overdue. What are you saying exactly? He asked. Are you saying that you want to take this job regardless of how it affects our marriage? The question forced me to confront the choice I'd been avoiding since Daniel had made his offer. Taking this position would mean more than returning to work. It would mean reclaiming an identity that existed independently of Tyler's approval or convenience. I'm saying that I want to take this job because of how it affects me, I replied. For the first time in 3 years, I'm making a decision based on what I want rather than what works best for everyone else. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of my statement. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine vulnerability I'd rarely heard from him. And what if what you want isn't compatible with what I want for us? The question hung between us, loaded with the potential to reshape our entire relationship. I thought about the woman who'd boarded that plane to Napa Valley 3 days ago, desperate for her husband's attention and willing to accommodate almost anything to preserve their marriage. That woman felt like a stranger to me now. Then we'll have to decide which is more important, I said. My right to pursue a meaningful career, or your preference for a wife who prioritizes your comfort over her own growth. As the words left my mouth, I realized I'd already made my choice. The question was whether Tyler was capable of accepting a marriage where his needs weren't automatically more important than mine. The following weeks transformed our Lincoln Park condo into a battlefield of passive-aggressive maneuvers and strategic positioning. Tyler had initially attempted to regain control through his standard arsenal of charm and negotiation, but when those tactics failed to deter me from accepting Daniel's offer, he'd shifted to a more subtle campaign of undermining my confidence and credibility. It started with small comments designed to sound supportive while actually expressing doubt. "Are you sure you're ready for such a demanding schedule?" he'd ask over breakfast, his tone carefully modulated to suggest concern rather than skepticism. "I just want to make sure you've thought through all the implications of this career change." When I'd signed the employment contract with Pacific Luxury Properties and returned it to Daniel's office via overnight courier, Tyler had watched me prepare the documents with an expression of barely concealed disbelief, as if he'd expected me to change my mind at the last moment and retreat to the safety of our established domestic arrangements. "It's really happening," he'd said as I'd sealed the envelope, and I couldn't tell whether his tone carried admiration or resentment. My first day at Pacific Luxury Properties' Chicago office was scheduled for a Monday morning in early November, and I'd spent the weekend preparing with the kind of methodical attention to detail that Tyler had always appreciated when it was directed toward his own professional needs. I'd researched the company's recent acquisitions, studied their development portfolio, and reviewed market analysis reports for luxury hospitality trends in the Midwest. The night before I was scheduled to start work, Tyler had made his most direct attempt yet to dissuade me from this new path. "Rachel," he'd said over dinner at our usual neighborhood restaurant, "I need to ask you something honestly. Is this job really about professional fulfillment, or is it about proving something to me?" The question had caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it revealed how completely Tyler misunderstood my motivations. He genuinely believed that my career renaissance was primarily about our relationship dynamics, rather than my own authentic desires and capabilities. "What do you think I'm trying to prove?" I'd asked, genuinely curious about his assessment of my behavior. Tyler had leaned forward across the table, his expression earnest in the way that had once made me feel like the center of his attention. "I think you're trying to show me that you don't need me," he'd said. "I think you're angry about our anniversary, and you're using this job to make me realize what I'd lose if I don't pay more attention to our marriage." The analysis had been so fundamentally wrong that I'd actually laughed, a sound that had clearly surprised Tyler with its genuine amusement rather than bitter sarcasm. "Tyler," I'd replied, "this isn't about you at all. This is about me remembering that I have professional value independent of our relationship. This is about using skills I'd forgotten I possessed and engaging with challenges that stimulate my mind." Tyler's expression had shifted to something approaching confusion, as if the concept of my independent motivation was genuinely difficult for him to process. "But you've never seemed unhappy with our life," he'd protested. "You've never complained about being bored or unstimulated. If you'd told me you wanted to return to work, we could have discussed options that would fit better with our existing commitments." That conversation had crystallized something important for me about our marriage dynamics. Tyler had never noticed my growing dissatisfaction because he'd never paid enough attention to my emotional state to recognize the signs. He'd assumed my accommodation meant contentment, and he'd interpreted my support for his career as evidence that I had no ambitions of my own. My first morning at Pacific Luxury Properties began at their River North offices, a sleek space that occupied 2 floors of a converted warehouse building. Daniel had arranged for me to meet with the entire Chicago development team, and I'd dressed carefully for the occasion in a tailored navy suit that projected authority without trying too hard to announce it. The team consisted of 6 professionals with backgrounds in architecture, urban planning, hospitality management, and financial analysis. As Daniel introduced me around the conference table, I'd been struck by how naturally the conversation had flowed towards substantive discussions of project challenges and strategic opportunities. Rachel's expertise in luxury hospitality operations will be invaluable as we evaluate potential properties, Daniel had explained to the group. Her background in sustainable tourism and cultural integration gives us exactly the perspective we need for the Chicago market. The project portfolio Daniel presented was more extensive than I'd realized during our initial conversations in Napa Valley. Pacific Luxury Properties had identified 8 potential development sites throughout Chicago, ranging from historic buildings in the Loop that could be converted to boutique hotels to waterfront properties in neighborhoods like River North and Streeterville that could accommodate new construction. My role would involve conducting comprehensive market analysis for each potential site, developing concept proposals that would appeal to both local residents and traveling guests, and overseeing the operational planning that would ensure each property could deliver authentic luxury experiences while maintaining profitability. We're not interested in creating generic luxury accommodations, explained Sarah Kim, the project's lead architect. Each property needs to reflect its neighborhood character while offering services and amenities that justify premium pricing. The challenge was exactly the kind of complex problem-solving I'd thrived on during graduate school, requiring both analytical rigor and creative vision. As we'd toured the first potential development site, a 1920s commercial building in the Loop that had been vacant for 2 years, I'd found myself automatically assessing sightlines, traffic patterns, and spatial relationships with the kind of professional instinct I'd thought I'd lost. "What do you see when you look at this space?" Daniel had asked as we'd stood in the building's main lobby, surrounded by original marble fixtures and Art Deco architectural details that had been preserved despite decades of neglect. "I see a property that could honor Chicago's architectural heritage while creating contemporary luxury experiences," I'd replied, my mind already visualizing how the space could be reconfigured to accommodate boutique hotel operations. The lobby could be restored to showcase the original design while incorporating modern check-in technology and flexible seating areas that serve both hotel guests and local residents. Daniel had smiled as I'd outlined my initial vision for the property, noting how the building's historic character could be preserved while adding modern amenities that would appeal to luxury travelers seeking authentic Chicago experiences. "That's exactly the kind of integrated thinking we need," he'd said. "Someone who understands that luxury doesn't mean abandoning local character." By the end of my first week, I'd completed preliminary assessments of 3 potential development sites and had begun developing comprehensive market analysis reports that would inform Pacific Luxury Properties investment decisions. The work was intellectually demanding in the best possible way, requiring me to synthesize complex data about tourism trends, neighborhood demographics, competitive positioning, and operational requirements. More importantly, I'd remembered what it felt like to be valued for my analytical capabilities, rather than my ability to manage someone else's logistics. My colleagues sought my input on strategic questions, asked thoughtful follow-up questions about my recommendations, and treated my professional opinions as substantive contributions rather than interesting observations. Tyler had initially shown polite interest in my work activities, asking general questions about my projects and colleagues the way he might inquire about a particularly engaging book or television series. But as the weeks progressed and it became clear that my job was demanding substantial time and energy, his questions had become more pointed and less supportive. "You seem to be working late almost every night," he'd observed one Thursday evening, when I'd returned home after a site visit and team meeting that had run until after 8 o'clock. "The Chicago project has aggressive timelines," I'd explained, reviewing my notes from the day's meetings while Tyler had watched television in our living room. "We're trying to complete initial assessments for all 8 properties before the end of the month so investors can make informed decisions about which sites to pursue." Tyler had muted the television and turned his full attention to me with an expression of carefully controlled frustration. "Rachel, I understand that you want to prove yourself in this new role, but you're working 60-hour weeks. When do we have time for our marriage?" The question had struck me as particularly ironic, given that Tyler routinely worked similar hours without ever expressing concern about their impact on our relationship. But more than that, it had revealed how he conceptualized our marriage as something that required my availability while accommodating his professional demands. "When do you make time for our marriage?" I'd asked. "When was the last time you declined a work commitment because you wanted to spend time with me?" Tyler had been quiet for a moment, clearly recognizing the parallel I was drawing between his career dedication and mine. "That's different," he'd said finally. "My career is established. I've already made the sacrifices necessary to build professional credibility. You're choosing to start over at a stage in our marriage when we should be focusing on building our life together." The conversation had continued for another hour, with Tyler attempting to convince me that my professional renaissance was somehow incompatible with our relationship goals, while remaining oblivious to how his own career priorities had shaped our marriage from the beginning. By November, my work with Pacific Luxury Properties had attracted attention from other firms in Chicago's hospitality and development community. I'd been invited to speak at a conference on sustainable luxury tourism, had been quoted in a Chicago Tribune article about boutique hotel trends, and had received inquiries from 2 other companies about potential consulting opportunities. The professional recognition felt intoxicating after 3 years of social invisibility. People were reading my analysis reports, citing my strategic recommendations, and seeking my expertise on complex industry challenges. I was being asked to participate in panel discussions and networking events, not as someone's wife, but as a respected professional with valuable insights to contribute. Tyler had been in the living room when Catherine Williams called to invite me to a reception for Chicago's luxury hospitality professionals. Catherine was the kind of influential socialite who commanded respect in both business and social circles. Someone whose events brought together the city's most successful entrepreneurs, developers, and cultural leaders. "Ms. Bennett," Catherine had said when I'd answered the phone, "I've been hearing wonderful things about your work with Pacific Luxury Properties. Several people have mentioned your innovative approach to cultural integration in luxury hotel development." Tyler had looked up from his laptop as I'd accepted Catherine's invitation, and I could see him processing the implications of my growing professional network. These weren't casual social connections, but strategic relationships that could significantly impact my career trajectory. "Who was that?" Tyler had asked after I'd ended the call. "Catherine Williams," I'd replied, noting how Tyler's expression had shifted to something approaching recognition. "She's hosting a reception for hospitality industry professionals next week." Catherine Williams was a name Tyler knew from business, journals, and society pages, someone whose husband's investment firm had backed several major Chicago development projects. Her support could open doors throughout the city's business community, and we both understood the significance of her personal attention to my career. "She called you directly?" Tyler had asked, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "She's heard about my work through industry contacts," I'd explained. "Apparently, my market analysis for the Loop development project has been circulating among potential investors." Tyler had closed his laptop and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of respect and something that might have been concern about losing control over our relationship dynamics. "This is really happening for you," he'd said, and for the first time since I'd started working, his tone had carried genuine acknowledgement of my professional success, rather than subtle attempts to undermine my confidence. The reception at Catherine Williams's River North penthouse had been everything I'd expected based on her reputation for sophisticated networking events. The guest list included Chicago's most influential hotel developers, restaurant entrepreneurs, cultural institution leaders, and luxury travel professionals. I'd been introduced as Pacific Luxury Properties Director of Development, and multiple conversations had focused on my strategic vision for boutique hospitality in Chicago, rather than my status as Tyler Bennett's wife. "Your approach to neighborhood integration is exactly what Chicago needs," Robert Hayes, the CEO of a major hotel management company, had told me during a conversation about preserving local character while creating luxury accommodations. 2. Many developers treat boutique hotels like generic luxury products that could exist anywhere. The evening had been professionally exhilarating, but it had also highlighted how completely my social identity had shifted over the past 2 months. At events with Tyler, I'd always been introduced in relationship to him, valued for my ability to make appropriate conversation and enhance his professional image. At Catherine's reception, I'd been valued for my own expertise and insights, sought out for my professional opinions rather than my social skills. When I'd returned home that evening, Tyler had been waiting in our living room with obvious anxiety about how the event had gone and what connections I might have made. "How was the reception?" he'd asked, and I could hear the underlying tension in his casual tone. "Productive," I'd replied, settling into the armchair across from him. I made several contacts who might be interested in consulting relationships, and Robert Hayes mentioned a potential partnership opportunity. Tyler's expression had darkened slightly at the mention of additional professional opportunities, and I'd realized that he was beginning to understand that my career renaissance wasn't a temporary phase, but a permanent transformation of our relationship dynamics. "Rachel," he'd said carefully, "I need to ask you something honestly. Are you happy in our marriage anymore?" The directness of the question had surprised me, though I'd recognized it as an inevitable conversation given how much had changed between us over the past 2 months. "I'm happy with who I'm becoming," I'd replied. "Whether that's compatible with our marriage remains to be seen." Tyler had leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "What does that mean, exactly?" I'd thought about our 3 years together, about how I'd gradually accommodated Tyler's priorities while abandoning my own ambitions, about how I'd measured my worth through his approval rather than my own achievements. "It means I've remembered that I'm capable of more than managing your household and social calendar," I'd said. "It means I've rediscovered professional ambitions that exist independently of our relationship." Tyler had been quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of my statement. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had carried a note of desperation I'd never heard from him before. "What if I changed?" he'd asked. "What if I made more time for us, paid more attention to your needs, supported your career the way you've always supported mine?" The offer had come too late to matter, though I'd appreciated his recognition of how unbalanced our relationship had become. The woman Tyler was now offering to support was someone different from the wife he'd taken for granted, someone who no longer needed his approval to feel valuable or his attention to feel worthy. "I don't think you understand what's changed," I'd replied gently. "This isn't about you paying more attention to me. This is about me not needing your attention to feel complete." Tyler's face had gone pale as he'd processed what I was telling him. For the first time in our marriage, he was confronting the possibility that his wife might be capable of happiness that didn't depend on his approval or participation. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" he'd asked, the words coming out barely above a whisper. I'd looked around our living room, at the furniture we'd selected together and the artwork that reflected Tyler's preferences more than mine, at the evidence of a life we'd built around his comfort and convenience rather than our shared dreams. "I'm saying I want a marriage between equals," I'd replied. "If you're not capable of that, then we'll need to consider other options." The conversation had ended without resolution, but with a new understanding between us. Tyler finally comprehended that I'd changed in ways that couldn't be managed or controlled, while I'd accepted that our marriage might not survive my transformation into an authentic version of myself. As I'd prepared for bed that night, I'd reflected on how completely my life had changed since that evening at O'Hare Airport, when Tyler had left me stranded on our anniversary. The woman who'd boarded that plane to Napa Valley had been desperate for her husband's attention and willing to accommodate almost anything to preserve their marriage. The woman looking back at me in our bedroom mirror was someone entirely different, someone who'd built professional credibility through her own expertise, who'd earned respect through her analytical capabilities, who'd created opportunities through her strategic vision rather than her relationship status. Tyler had accidentally given me the greatest gift possible when he'd chosen work over our anniversary. He'd forced me to rediscover that I was capable of creating my own adventures, building my own professional relationships, and finding my own sources of satisfaction and recognition. Now the question was whether he could accept being married to someone who no longer needed him to feel complete, or whether his identity was too dependent on being the more important partner in our relationship. Based on his reaction to my career success, I was beginning to suspect that Tyler preferred the version of me who'd made his life easier rather than the version who challenged him to be a better husband. And if that was the case, then our marriage had been built on a foundation that could never support two equals. The Chicago Tribune article featuring my analysis of boutique hotel trends in the Midwest was published on a crisp December morning, accompanied by a professional photograph that captured me standing in the lobby of the recently acquired Loop property that Pacific Luxury Properties was converting into their flagship Chicago hotel. The headline read, "Local Hospitality Expert Transforms Chicago's Luxury Travel Landscape," and the article positioned me as a leading voice in the city's evolving tourism industry. I discovered the article while having coffee at a cafe near our office, scrolling through the Tribune's business section on my tablet before heading into what promised to be an intensive day of investor presentations. Seeing my name and professional accomplishments featured so prominently in Chicago's premier newspaper felt surreal, a validation of the career resurrection I'd never imagined possible just 6 months earlier. My phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from colleagues, industry, contacts, and business associates who'd seen the article. Daniel had forwarded it to Pacific Luxury Properties' executive team with a note praising my strategic vision and analytical capabilities. Catherine Williams had sent a text message inviting me to speak at an upcoming conference on sustainable tourism development. Even Elena Martinez from Domain Martinez had somehow seen the article and had sent an email expressing her excitement about my professional success. But it was the message I didn't receive that spoke volumes about how completely my relationship with Tyler had deteriorated over the past month. We'd been living in the same apartment while existing in essentially separate worlds. Our interactions limited to polite inquiries about logistical matters and careful avoidance of any topics that might trigger another confrontation about our marriage's fundamental incompatibilities. Tyler had left for work before I'd woken up that morning, a pattern that had become routine as we'd both recognized that our morning conversations inevitably devolved into tense negotiations about whose professional obligations took priority. I'd stopped expecting him to show interest in my career achievements, just as he'd apparently stopped expecting me to prioritize his comfort over my own ambitions. The investor presentation that afternoon was the culmination of 3 months of intensive market research and strategic planning. Pacific Luxury Properties had invited potential financial partners to review our comprehensive development proposal for 5 boutique hotel properties throughout Chicago, representing a total investment of over $200 million in luxury hospitality infrastructure. I'd prepared meticulously for the presentation, creating detailed financial projections, competitive analysis reports, and operational planning documents that demonstrated both the profitability potential and cultural impact of our proposed developments. The presentation would establish not only Pacific Luxury Properties' credibility in the Chicago market, but also my reputation as a strategic thinker capable of managing complex, high-stakes business initiatives. The conference room at our River North offices was filled with representatives from Chicago's most prestigious investment firms, including several individuals whose names I recognized from business journals and society pages. These were people who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in development capital, whose decisions could transform entire neighborhoods and create thousands of jobs. Daniel introduced me to the assembled investors with obvious pride in my professional accomplishments and confidence in my analytical capabilities. Rachel Bennett brings a unique combination of academic expertise and practical experience to luxury hospitality development, he explained. Her strategic vision for cultural integration and sustainable tourism has been instrumental in shaping our Chicago expansion strategy. As I began presenting our market analysis and development proposals, I felt the same intellectual excitement that had driven me through graduate school. The questions from investors were sophisticated and challenging, requiring me to defend my assumptions about tourism trends, neighborhood dynamics, and competitive positioning with detailed evidence and logical reasoning. Ms. Bennett asked Patricia Goldman, a senior partner at one of Chicago's largest investment firms, "Your projections assume significant growth in luxury business travel to Chicago over the next 5 years. What evidence supports this assumption, given current economic uncertainties?" The question was exactly the kind of rigorous scrutiny I'd prepared for, and I responded with comprehensive data about corporate relocation trends, conference industry growth, and Chicago's evolving reputation as a technology and financial services hub. My answer demonstrated not only thorough research, but also sophisticated understanding of how macroeconomic factors influence local hospitality markets. The presentation continued for over 2 hours, with investors expressing particular interest in our approach to neighborhood integration and cultural authenticity. Several participants mentioned that they'd been looking for development opportunities that could generate substantial returns while also contributing positively to Chicago's cultural landscape. "This is exactly the kind of thoughtful development Chicago needs," commented Robert Hayes, whose hotel management company had been exploring expansion opportunities throughout the Midwest. "Too many luxury properties treat their locations as interchangeable backdrops rather than integral elements of the guest experience." By the time the presentation concluded, Pacific Luxury Properties had received preliminary commitment letters from 3 major investors, representing sufficient capital to move forward with our most promising development sites. More importantly, I'd established myself as a credible strategic voice in Chicago's hospitality investment community, someone whose analysis and recommendations carried weight with the city's most influential business leaders. Daniel was clearly thrilled with the presentation's outcome, and he'd arranged for our team to celebrate that evening at one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. As we'd gathered for dinner, I'd felt the same sense of professional accomplishment that I'd once imagined Tyler experienced after successful client presentations or important deal closures. "Rachel, that was extraordinary," Sarah Kim had said over champagne and perfectly prepared seafood. "The way you handled Patricia Goldman's questions about market projections was masterful. You demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical rigor that makes investors feel confident about committing substantial capital." The conversation had continued throughout the evening, with my colleagues expressing genuine appreciation for my contributions to the project's success. This was the first time in my adult life that I'd been celebrated for my own professional achievements, rather than my ability to support someone else's career advancement. When I'd finally returned home that evening, still energized by the day's success and the evening's celebration, I'd found Tyler waiting in our living room with an expression I'd never seen before. He was holding a printed copy of the Tribune article, and his face carried a mixture of emotions I couldn't immediately identify. "Congratulations," he'd said as I'd removed my coat and set down my briefcase. "I saw the article this morning. It's quite impressive." The formal tone in his voice had suggested that he was struggling to process the implications of my public recognition as a business leader rather than simply his supportive spouse. This was probably the first time Tyler had seen my professional accomplishments acknowledged in a forum that his own colleagues and clients would read. "Thank you," I'd replied, settling into the armchair across from him. The investor presentation went well today, too. We secured funding commitments for 3 of our 5 proposed properties. Tyler had been quiet for several minutes, clearly processing information that challenged his understanding of my capabilities and ambitions. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had carried a note of genuine confusion. "I don't understand what happened to you," he'd said. 6 months ago, you were content managing our household and social obligations. Now you're featured in business newspapers and making presentations to major investors. It's like you became a completely different person. The observation had been more accurate than Tyler probably realized. I had become a different person, or rather, I'd remembered who I'd been before I'd made accommodating his preferences the central organizing principle of my life. I didn't become a different person, I'd replied. I stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't. Tyler had leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. But you were happy, Rachel. We were happy together. You never complained about our life or expressed dissatisfaction with our marriage. I'd thought about our 3 years together, about how I'd gradually trained myself to find satisfaction in Tyler's achievements rather than pursuing my own, about how I'd convinced myself that supporting his career was a form of personal fulfillment rather than self-erasure. I convinced myself I was happy, I'd said, but happiness based on self-denial isn't sustainable. Eventually, you realize that you've lost track of who you actually are underneath all the accommodation and compromise. Tyler had been quiet again, and I could see him struggling to reconcile the successful professional described in the Tribune article with the accommodating wife he'd grown comfortable living with. What does this mean for us? He'd asked finally. Where does our marriage fit into this new life you're building? The question had forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding for weeks. My professional renaissance hadn't just restored my confidence and sense of purpose. It had also revealed how fundamentally incompatible our marriage had become with my authentic self. I don't know, I'd admitted. The woman you married was someone who prioritized your needs over her own ambitions. The woman I am now isn't capable of that kind of self-sacrifice. Tyler's face had gone pale as he'd processed what I was telling him. For the first time in our relationship, he was confronting the possibility that his wife's personal growth might be incompatible with his vision of our marriage. So you're saying you want a divorce? He'd said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. I'd looked around our living room, at the evidence of a life we'd built around Tyler's preferences and professional obligations, at the beautiful apartment that had never quite felt like home because I'd never been allowed to be fully myself within its walls. I'm saying I want to be married to someone who values my professional success rather than feeling threatened by it, I'd replied. Someone who celebrates my achievements rather than questioning whether they're compatible with our relationship. Tyler had stood up abruptly, beginning the restless pacing that had become his standard response to conversations he couldn't control through charm or negotiation. This is about that night at the airport, isn't it? He'd said. You're still angry that I missed our anniversary dinner, and this whole career renaissance is just elaborate revenge. The accusation had revealed how completely Tyler misunderstood both my motivations and the significance of what had happened over the past 6 months. He genuinely believed that my professional transformation was primarily about our relationship rather than my own authentic desires and capabilities. Tyler, I'd said, standing up to face him directly. This stopped being about you the moment I realized I could be happy without your approval. The statement had hit its target precisely. Tyler had stopped pacing and stared at me with an expression of genuine shock, as if the concept of my independent happiness was something he'd never considered possible. I don't understand, he'd said quietly. I thought we were building a life together. I thought we shared the same goals and priorities. I'd thought about our early relationship, about how Tyler had initially been attracted to my ambition and intelligence before gradually encouraging me to channel those qualities towards supporting his career rather than developing my own. We shared your goals and priorities, I'd corrected. I just convinced myself that was the same thing as partnership. Tyler had sunk back onto the couch, looking suddenly older and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. For the first time since I'd started working, he'd seemed to grasp that this wasn't a temporary rebellion, but a permanent transformation of our relationship dynamics. What happens now? He'd asked. Do we try counseling? Do we attempt to rebuild our marriage around these new realities? Or do we accept that we've grown in incompatible directions? The questions had been fair and mature, reflecting a level of self-awareness I hadn't expected from Tyler, given his previous attempts to control and manage my career decisions. I think, I'd said carefully, that we need to acknowledge that we built our marriage around a version of me that no longer exists. The question is whether you're capable of being married to who I actually am. Tyler had been quiet for a long time, clearly processing the implications of my statement. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had carried a note of genuine sadness rather than anger or frustration. "I fell in love with your ambition and intelligence," he'd said. "But then I spent 3 years encouraging you to express those qualities in service of my career rather than your own. I don't think I realized what I was doing until I saw how capable you are when you're pursuing your own goals." The admission had been more honest and self-aware than anything Tyler had said during our previous conversations about my career. For the first time, he'd acknowledged his role in shaping our marriage dynamics rather than simply reacting to my transformation. "And now?" I'd asked. Tyler had looked directly at me, and I'd seen genuine respect in his expression for the first time since I'd started working. "Now, I think I understand that I was married to someone I'd never really bothered to know," he'd said. "And I think you're right that the woman you've become deserves a partner who values her success rather than feeling diminished by it." The conversation had continued for another hour, with both of us finally acknowledging that our marriage had been built on fundamentally unequal terms that neither of us wanted to perpetuate. Tyler had admitted that he'd grown comfortable with having a wife whose primary function was to enhance his life rather than pursue her own interests. I'd acknowledged that I'd enabled this dynamic by convincing myself that supporting his career was a form of personal fulfillment. By the time we'd finished talking, we'd reached a mutual understanding that our marriage couldn't survive my transformation into an authentic version of myself. Tyler needed a partner who would prioritize his comfort and convenience, while I needed someone who would celebrate my professional achievements, rather than viewing them as threats to our relationship balance. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly amicable, perhaps because we'd both recognized that our fundamental incompatibilities couldn't be resolved through compromise or counseling. Tyler had been generous with the financial settlement, acknowledging that my career sacrifices during our marriage had contributed to his own professional advancement. I'd been fair about dividing our shared assets, taking only what I needed to establish an independent household that could support my new life. By spring, I'd moved into a sleek one-bedroom apartment in River North, walking distance from Pacific Luxury Properties offices, and perfectly suited to my new identity as a successful business professional. The space was smaller than our Lincoln Park condo, but felt infinitely more spacious because every element reflected my own preferences, rather than careful compromises designed to accommodate Tyler's comfort. Pacific Luxury Properties' Chicago expansion had exceeded all initial projections, with our boutique hotels achieving occupancy rates and revenue figures that had attracted attention from hospitality industry publications and investment analysts. My strategic vision for cultural integration and neighborhood partnership had been featured in 3 major trade journals, and I'd been invited to speak at conferences in New York, San Francisco, and London. More importantly, I'd built a professional identity that existed independently of any relationship status or domestic obligations. I was recognized as an expert in luxury hospitality development, someone whose analysis and recommendations influenced major investment decisions and shaped industry trends. Daniel and I had developed a close working relationship that had gradually evolved into something more personal, though we'd both been careful to maintain professional boundaries until after my divorce was finalized. He understood my career ambitions because he shared them, and he valued my professional expertise because he'd seen its impact on our shared projects. "You've transformed not just Pacific Luxury Properties' Chicago strategy, but the entire approach to boutique hotel development in secondary markets," he'd told me during a quiet dinner celebrating our latest investor commitment. Your integration model is being studied by hospitality programs at Cornell and Northwestern. The recognition felt gratifying in ways I'd never experienced during my marriage to Tyler. This was appreciation for my own intellectual contributions rather than my ability to support someone else's achievements. This was respect earned through analytical rigor and strategic vision rather than social skills and accommodation. On a warm evening in late May, almost exactly 1 year after Tyler had left me stranded at O'Hare Airport, I'd been walking along the Chicago Riverwalk after another successful investor presentation when my phone had buzzed with an unexpected text message. The message was from Tyler, the first direct communication we'd had since finalizing our divorce 3 months earlier. "Saw your interview in Forbes," he'd written. "Congratulations on everything you've accomplished. You were right about needing to pursue your own path." I'd stopped walking and looked out at the Chicago River, reflecting on how completely my life had changed since that devastating evening when I'd realized my husband had forgotten our anniversary. The woman who'd boarded that plane to Napa Valley had been desperate for Tyler's attention and approval, willing to accommodate almost anything to preserve a marriage that had required her to remain invisible. The woman reading his message now was someone entirely different. Someone who'd built professional credibility through her own expertise, who'd earned respect through strategic vision and analytical capabilities, who'd created opportunities through hard work rather than relationship status. Tyler's abandonment at the airport had accidentally been the greatest gift he could have given me. He'd forced me to remember that I was capable of creating my own adventures, building my own professional relationships, and finding my own sources of satisfaction and recognition. I'd typed back a brief response. "Thank you. I hope you find the kind of partnership you're looking for." As I'd continued walking along the Riverwalk, I'd thought about the various forms revenge could take. Tyler had probably expected me to make him pay for his neglect through anger, recrimination, or attempts to damage his professional reputation. Instead, I'd made him pay by becoming someone who no longer needed his approval to feel valuable, someone who'd built a life so fulfilling that his absence was irrelevant rather than devastating. The best revenge, I'd realized, wasn't making Tyler suffer for abandoning me. The best revenge was discovering that I could create extraordinary happiness without him, that I could build professional success and personal satisfaction independently of his attention or support. 6 months later, Pacific Luxury Properties announced my promotion to Regional Director of Development, overseeing boutique hotel projects throughout the Midwest and establishing consulting partnerships with luxury hospitality brands across the country. The position came with substantial compensation, international travel opportunities, and the kind of professional recognition I'd once thought was permanently beyond my reach. The announcement was featured in multiple business publications, with journalists noting how my innovative approach to cultural integration and sustainable luxury had influenced industry standards for boutique hotel development. I'd been invited to join the boards of 2 hospitality trade organizations and had been asked to contribute chapters to academic publications about the future of luxury travel. Standing in my River North office on the morning the promotion was announced, looking out at the Chicago skyline that had become the backdrop for my professional renaissance, I'd reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought me from abandoned wife to respected business leader. Tyler had left me stranded at an airport on our anniversary, thinking he was choosing a client meeting over a romantic dinner. What he'd actually done was set me free to rediscover capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed, to rebuild professional relationships that valued my expertise, and to create a life that didn't require his participation to feel complete. The woman who'd married Tyler Bennett had believed that love meant making yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's comfort. The woman I'd become understood that authentic partnership required 2 people who celebrated each other's growth, rather than feeling threatened by it. As I'd prepared for my first board meeting as regional director, I'd realized that Tyler had ultimately given me exactly what I'd always wanted: the opportunity to be seen and valued for who I really was. He'd just done it accidentally, by abandoning me so completely that I'd been forced to remember I could create my own visibility, my own worth, and my own extraordinary life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.